What's going on, knowledge seekers? Forgive me, I'm a little sick, so I might cough or something during this. I try to get through as fast as possible. The summary of the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua. Let's back up and remember the story so far. So God chose Abraham, and then his family became the people of Israel, who are then enslaved down in Egypt. And so through Moses, God rescues Israel out of Egypt. He made a covenant with them at Mount Sinai. He brought them through the wilderness. So Israel then camped outside the promised land. And Moses called them to obey God's commands so that they could show all the other nations what God is like. The book of Joshua picks up right after Moses has died and Israel is ready to enter the land. So the story of Joshua is designed with four main movements. Joshua first leads Israel into the promised land. Then once they are there, they meet all this hostility from the Canaanites. So they engage them in battle. Then after their victories, Joshua divides up the promised land as an inheritance for the 12 tribes. And then the book concludes with these final speeches that Joshua gives to the people. So let's dive in, and we'll see how it all flows together. The first section begins with Moses' death, and Joshua is appointed as Israel's new leader. And the author intentionally presents Joshua as a new Moses. So like Moses, Joshua calls the people to obey the Torah, which means the covenant commands that they were given to Mount Sinai. Then Joshua sent spies into the land, just as Moses did back in Numbers, chapters 13 and 14, except it goes way better this time. In fact, even some Canaanites turn and follow the God of Israel, Yahweh. Joshua then leads all Israel across the Jordan River and into the land, just like the sea parted for Moses in Exodus. So here the river of Jordan parts, and the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant across, leading all Israel with them. Now in chapter 5, the story transitions so that the people look back to their roots as Yahweh's covenant people. And so the new generation is circumcised, and they celebrate their first Passover in the land, but then turn prepared to go forward. And Joshua has this crazy encounter with a mysterious warrior who it turns out is an angelic commander of God's army. And Joshua asks, "Are you for us? Are you for our enemies?" And the warrior responds, "Neither." Which shows that the real question here is whether Joshua is on Yahweh's side. It makes clear that this whole story is not about Israel versus the Canaanites. Rather, this is God's battle, and Israel is going to play the role of spectators or sometimes supporters in God's plan. Which leads to the next section. We find stories about all these conflicts that Israel had with different Canaanite groups. And the first part retells the story of two battles in detail. And that's followed by a series of short stories that's condensed years of battles into a few brief summaries. So the first two battles are against Jericho and then Ai. And then they offer these contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. At Jericho, Israel is to take a completely passive approach, so they lead God's presence in the ark, lead them around the city to music for 6 days. And just like Rehab turned to God of Israel, maybe the people of Jericho would do the same. But they don't, and so on. The seventh day, the priests blew the trumpets, and the walls came falling down, leading Israel to victory. The point of the story is that God is the one who will deliver his people. Israel simply needs to trust and wait. Now, the next story of the battle that makes the opposite point. So, there's this Israelite named Ahan, and he steals from Jericho some of the devoted goods that were to belong to God alone. And then he lies about it. It's a pretty lame move, considering all he's done for Israel. And so Israel goes into battle with the city of Ai. And they're totally defeated. And it's only after a humble repentance and severely dealing with Han's sin that Israel gains victory. And so together, these two stories, they're placed right up front to make an important point. If Israel is going to inherit the land, they have to be obedient and trust in God's commands. They don't get special treatment now. The second part of this section begins with the Gibeonites, a Canaanite people group, and they do just what Rehab did, as they turn to follow the God of Israel. And they make peace with Israel. This is in contrast to all these other Canaanite kings who start to form alliances and coalitions, and they want to destroy Israel. So Israel engages them in battle, and they win by a landslide. And so this whole section concludes with the summary list of all these victories won by Moses and then by Joshua. Now let's stop for a second, because odds are that these stories and the violence in them are going to bother you. If you're a follower of Jesus, you're bound to wonder, like, didn't Jesus say to love your enemies? Why is God declaring war here? So first, why the Canaanites? The main reason are actually given early in the biblical story, is that the culture of the Canaanites had become extremely immoral, corrupt, especially when it comes to sex. Go check out Leviticus chapter 18. And they also widely practice child sacrifice. Go see Deuteronomy chapter 12. And so God didn't want these practices to be influenced Israel. The Canaanites had to go, which raised the second question. Did God actually command the destruction of all the Canaanites? Like a genocide? So at first glance, you look at the phrase used in the stories. They totally destroyed them. They left no survivors or anything breathing. But when you look a second time more closely, you'll see that these phrases are clearly metaphorical and not literal. So go back to the original command about the Canaanites and do the, This is Romans chapter 7. Israel is the first told to, to drive out the Canaanites, and totally destroy them. And then that's followed by commands to not intermarry with them or enter into the business deals with them. So you can't marry someone that you've destroyed. I think you get the point. The same idea applies to the stories in Joshua. Look closely. For example, we're told in Joshua chapter 10 that Israel left no survivors in the cities of Hebron or Debir. But then later in the chapter 15, we see these towns and they're still popular. Later by, let's say, yeah, later by Canaanites, and what we're seeing is that Joshua fits in with other ancient battle accounts by using non-literal hyperbolic languages as part of the narrative style. And so the word genocide doesn't actually fit. What we see here, especially in light of the stories about the Canaanites who did turn to the God of Israel, like Rahab, or the Gibeonites, God was open to those who would turn to him. The last thing to think about is that these stories make a unique moment in Israel's history. These battles were limited to the handful of people groups living in the land of Canaan. With all other nations, Israel was commanded by God to pursue peace. Go read Deuteronomy chapter 20. So the purpose of these battles stories was never to tell you, the reader, to go commit violence and in God's name. Rather, they show God's bringing his justice on the unjust. This justice on human evil at a unique moment in history, and how he delivered Israel from pretty much from being annihilated by the Canaanites. Now let's go back to the book of Deuteronomy. After years of battles, we see an aging Joshua, and he starts dividing up the land for the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of the section is like a list of boundary lines. And let's be honest, it's kind of boring. It's like reading a map that has no pictures. But for the Israelites, these lists were super important. This was the fulfillment of God's ancient promise to Abraham that his descendants would inherit the promised land. And so now it was all coming to pass, right down to the detail, which leads to the final section. Joshua gives 2 speeches to the people. They're very similar to do the final speeches of Moses. And he runs on, and then he runs on to him. Joshua reminds them of God's generosity, how he brought them into the land and rescued them from the Canaanites. And so he calls them to turn away from the Canaanite gods and be faithful to the covenant they made. If they do it, it will lead to life and blessing in the land. But if they are unfaithful, Israel will call down on itself the same divine judgment that the Canaanites experienced. Will be kicked off the land into exile. And so Joshua leaves Israel with a choice. What is this role going to do? That's the big question that looms as the story ends, and that's the book of Joshua.